In the ruthless courts of ancient China, silence wasn't just golden, it was enforced with blood. Li Si, once the most powerful man in the empire besides the emperor himself, learned this the hard way. His life was not taken quietly. It was erased violently, beginning with the removal of his voice. This isn't a metaphor. They cut out his tongue. This is not a forgotten myth or symbolic execution. It has a documented punishment carried out in the public square under the Qin Dynasty, the first imperial dynasty of unified China. A punishment reserved for the most dangerous type of man, one whose words had built empires, and now threatened them. But before Li Si was silenced, he spoke louder than anyone in Chinese history. He was born around 80 BCE in the Warring States period, a time when China was divided into rival kingdoms constantly at war with each other. Li Si was from the state of Chu, born to a low-ranking family, but his ambitions were high, and his mind was sharper than most. He studied under the legendary philosopher Han Feizi, the founder of legalism, a brutal political philosophy built on strict laws, harsh punishments, and the belief that people only obey power, not virtue. Li Si took these ideas and turned them into a national weapon. When the state of Qin began its aggressive conquest of rival states, Li Si offered his services to Yingzhong, the king of Qin, a man who would later become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. Li Si wasn't just an advisor, he became the chancellor, the top official in the most powerful empire on earth at the time. It was Li Si who masterminded the unification of Chinese script, weights and measures, roads, and law codes. It was Li Si who proposed the burning of books and the burial of scholars to eliminate competing ideologies. And it was Li Si who wrote the laws that gave the emperor total control. His logic was brutal: unity through obedience, order through fear. And for years, it worked. The Qin state, under Qin Shi Huang and Li Si, conquered all rival kingdoms and created a centralized empire. But what they built in stone was held together with suspicion, betrayal, and constant surveillance. In the 10 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang died while traveling. His death was kept secret by the two men closest to him, Li Si and the palace eunuch Zhao Gao. Why? Because the emperor had designated another son as heir, not the one Zhao Gao could control. Together, Li Si and Zhao Gao forged an imperial decree declaring Qin Shi, a weaker, more pliable son, the new emperor, and they forced the rightful heir to commit suicide. It was a masterstroke of political manipulation. But that alliance wouldn't last. Zhao Gao, cunning and ruthless, began manipulating the new emperor. He turned him against Li Si, planting seeds of doubt and paranoia. He whispered that Li Si was too powerful, too clever, that he had betrayed one emperor and would soon betray another. The emperor listened. Li Si was arrested, dragged from the palace in chains, denied a fair trial, and held for weeks without access to his family or allies. What followed wasn't just an execution, it was a performance. In the Xianying marketplace, where thousands gathered to witness the fall of the empire's greatest voice, Li Si was dragged before the people he had once ruled over. As the crowd watched in silence, his tongue was cut out. It wasn't enough to kill him. First, they had to humiliate him. This was a direct punishment for what he had done with words, not swords. His voice had shaped laws, crushed enemies, censored scholars, and ruled an emperor. Now, that same tongue was tossed onto the dirt before him, a bloody reminder of what happens to those who speak too well. And then came the death. He was tied to horses, his limbs pulled apart, his bones shattered, and his remains were paraded through the streets. His entire clan was executed with him. His sons, brothers, and even grandchildren were wiped out under the principle of collective punishment, a legalist policy he himself had promoted. The laws he had created were used to destroy him. But the story doesn't end there. Li Si's death marked the collapse of the Qin Dynasty. Within 3 years, the empire he helped build fell into rebellion and chaos. The dynasty that united China for the first time couldn't survive without its architect. And history remembered this irony. The fall of Li Si was more than political, it was poetic. A brutal irony soaked into the soil of China's first empire. He had risen by enforcing legalism, by purging dissent, by reducing scholars and poets to ashes so that only the law remained. But in the end, the machine he built consumed him. Because in the world he helped create, loyalty was never stronger than fear. When the blade took his tongue, it was not just punishment for treason, it was a final warning. This wasn't just about silencing a man. It was about sending a message to all who followed. No matter how close you are to the emperor, no matter how high you rise, you can still be erased. But Li Si wasn't just another minister. His policies had sunk deep into the bones of the state. The book burnings he ordered destroyed volumes of Confucian and Taoist philosophy, centuries of thought, gone in flames. The burial of scholars buried ideas along with men. And yet, his downfall became the seed of rebellion. After his death, the people remembered. They remembered the tyranny, the executions, the silencing, and they remembered that even Li Si could bleed. Within 2 years, rebellion erupted across the land. Farmers, former nobles, and old enemies rose up, led by a man named Liu Bang, who would later become Emperor Gaozu of Han, founder of the Han Dynasty. Ironically, it was the memory of Li Si that helped shape what came next. The Han Dynasty would rule differently, not purely by legalism, but by blending it with Confucian principles. Balance was restored, but only after thousands had died. And yet, the Qin system survived in parts. The centralization of power, the bureaucratic control, the uniform laws, all rooted in Li Si's vision, remained as foundational structures. He died, but his system lived on. Let's not forget what Li Si truly represented. He was not a villain in the beginning. He believed in order. He feared the chaos of the warring states. He wanted unity. But to build that unity, he sacrificed freedom. He feared the power of words, so he silenced them. He feared diversity of thought, so he burned it. And eventually, when another man feared him, he was silenced in the very same way. There's something chillingly modern about his story. A man who built systems of control, only to be consumed by them. A ruler of laws who died because of their misuse. A speaker whose voice was so feared, the only solution was to cut it from his mouth. In that moment, the public cutting of his tongue has echoed across centuries. It's been referenced in poems, plays, and political commentaries throughout Chinese history. A grim reminder that words are powerful enough to terrify emperors. Even today, Li Si's story is taught in Chinese history. Class is not just for his accomplishments, but for his end. And the lessons are always the same. Systems without checks destroy themselves. Loyalty to power without principles is a death sentence. And a government that fears speech will always, eventually, fear its own servants. The exact location of Li Si's death, the square where he was mutilated and executed, is now lost beneath modern buildings and tourist streets in Xianying, once the capital of Qin. But the silence he left behind, that still lingers. Every empire has its Li Si. Every court has its Zhao Gao. And every tyrant eventually turns on his own. In ancient China, executions were never just about death. They were about display. The spectacle was part of the sentence, and in Li Si's case, that spectacle was surgical. By cutting out his tongue in front of thousands, they were stripping him not just of life, but of legacy. And yet, in that moment of brutality, they cemented his legend, because they proved exactly how dangerous he truly was. Not with armies, not with weapons, but with ideas. What made Li Si truly dangerous wasn't just his intelligence. It was his ability to convince. He convinced the emperor to rewrite tradition. He convinced the people that unity was worth sacrifice. He convinced an entire dynasty to abandon its philosophies and embrace control at any cost. And because he wielded words so well, those words had to be destroyed with him. After his death, official court historians tried to erase his influence. His name appeared less in state records, Monuments bearing his contributions were quietly removed or reattributed to others. His own system of information control was now being used against him. But that didn't stop the people from remembering. Folktales sprang up around his execution. Some said that when his tongue was cut out, it twitched on the ground, still trying to speak. Others whispered that his spirit lingered, unable to rest, watching each new ruler and waiting to see if they too would fall to treachery. One legend says that Zhao Gao, the man who betrayed him, was later killed by a soldier who had once served under Li Si, as if the old chancellor had reached beyond the grave to get his revenge. But these are just stories. The truth is more unsettling. Li Si's fate became a template for how political dissent would be handled for generations. When later dynasties wanted to silence someone, they didn't always kill them right away. They erased their voice first. Cutting out the tongue became a symbol of absolute state power. It happened to scholars. It happened to monks. It happened to poets. And every time, the ghost of Li Si hovered nearby, the first and most famous victim of that specific mutilation. The Qin Dynasty itself crumbled not long after his death. The people who had once feared the empire rose up with a fury. Cities burned, officials were beheaded, statues were toppled, and the fragile unity Li Si helped forge was shattered. But even as the Qin fell, its methods endured, because what Li Si built was not just an empire. It was a blueprint for authoritarian control, enforced silence, and the use of fear to maintain power. And that blueprint outlived him by thousands of years. Today, historians still debate Li Si's legacy. Some argue he was a necessary evil, a man who brought order to a chaotic land. Others say he was a tyrant in scholar's clothing, responsible for one of the darkest eras of suppression in ancient Chinese history. But one thing is undeniable: his story matters, because it shows what happens when laws lose their soul, when order is pursued without compassion, when words are treated as weapons, and the state becomes a butcher. His life was a rise to power. His death was a fall into silence. But his story is a warning, one that still echoes, even after 2,000 years. So remember this: the man whose voice built an empire was destroyed not by a sword, but by fear of his voice.